The Habsburgs bred horses. They bred dogs. They ran one of the most sophisticated animal breeding programs in European history. They kept meticulous stud books. They tracked bloodlines across generations. They knew, absolutely knew, what happens when you breed too closely. So why did they do this crazy thing to themselves for over 200 years? You've seen the pictures. That jaw, that famous Habsburg jaw, jutting forward like an accusation in bone, getting worse with each generation until the final Spanish Habsburg couldn't even chew his own food. Someone actually researched whether Jay Leno is related to the Habsburgs. He's not. But the fact that people wondered tells you everything about how notorious that jaw became. Here's the thing. This isn't a video about what the Habsburgs did to themselves. You've seen that video. You know about the deformed jaws, the stillbirths, the kings who could barely function. This is a video about why. It's a prosecutor's case, and the charge is this. The Habsburgs made a cold, calculated decision that concentrated power was worth deformed babies and early deaths. They looked at the political math and decided that keeping their empire whole mattered more than keeping their children healthy. And we can prove it. Let's start with the evidence that they knew, because that's the foundation of everything. Without proving they understood what close breeding does, this whole argument collapses into they were just ignorant, which is the boring take, and it happens to be wrong. The Spanish riding school in Vienna was established in 1572 under Habsburg patronage, not 1573, not around that time, 1572. And from day one, it operated under strict breeding protocols that would make modern geneticists nod in approval. Here's how meticulous they were. Every stallion entering the breeding program had to be evaluated not just for its own qualities, but for its lineage. The stud books, maintained in the imperial archives with the same care given to royal birth records, tracked which horses descended from which bloodlines. Breeders documented coat colors, temperaments, physical conformations, and, crucially, which crosses had produced successful offspring and which had produced failures. The Habsburgs understood something fundamental. If you bred a stallion to his own daughter, you might get a foal that looked fine, maybe even performed well. But do it again in the next generation, and again after that, and you'd start seeing problems. Horses that tired easily, horses with weak legs, horses that couldn't reproduce. The Lipizzaner breed that still performs at the Spanish riding school today exists because the Habsburgs maintained what they called refreshing the bloodline, periodically introducing stallions from outside breeding programs to prevent the accumulation of defects. They had a word for what happened when you didn't refresh the line. They called it going stale. Stale bloodlines produced stale horses, weak, sickly, unable to perform the demanding haute école movements that made the Spanish riding school famous across Europe. The protocol was explicit. Track the breeding, avoid close crosses, introduce new blood when the line shows signs of weakness. They applied this knowledge religiously to their horses. They maintained identical standards for their hunting dogs. The imperial kennels kept breeding records documenting which hounds came from which lines. When a particular bloodline started producing dogs with hip problems or weak constitutions, the breeders knew to outcross, to bring in dogs from other kennels to strengthen the line. And then these same Habsburgs walked upstairs from the stables, looked at their own family tree, and did the exact opposite with their children. Now, you might say, maybe they didn't make the connection. Maybe understanding horse breeding doesn't automatically translate to human reproduction in the 16th century mind. Fair point. Let's see if anyone warned them. The papal dispensation system creates a paper trail of acknowledged risk. When Philip II sought permission to marry his niece Anna in 1570, His request to Pope Pius V had to specify the exact degree of consanguinity and provide justification for why political necessity outweighed church concerns. The dispensation document, preserved in Vatican archives, granted permission while explicitly noting the canonical prohibition against uncle-niece unions. The Church had maintained these prohibitions since the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215. Why? Because medieval theologians observed that children of close relatives suffered higher rates of deformity and early death. They didn't have the word genetics. They didn't need it. They could count dead babies. Every time a Habsburg ruler requested such a dispensation, and the requests came generation after generation, they were formally acknowledging that the Church considered these marriages dangerous. The dispensation wasn't just a formality. It was a legal document that said, in effect, "We know this marriage violates canonical law designed to prevent birth defects. We're asking you to make an exception anyway." Philip II asked for that exception. Philip III asked for it. Philip IV asked for it. The Austrian Habsburgs asked for it too. Leopold I, Charles VI. Generation after generation, walking into the Vatican with their hats in their hands, admitting the Church was right to be concerned, and then requesting permission to proceed anyway. But wait, there's more. Foreign ambassadors provided even more explicit warnings, preserved in diplomatic correspondence across European archives. The Venetian ambassador to Madrid in 1598, Francesco Soranzo, reported to the Doge that the Spanish royal family showed obvious signs of physical decline. He attributed it directly to their marriage practices. He noted that while the Spanish justified these unions on grounds of preserving dynastic purity, the results visible in the royal children suggested the policy was producing weaker heirs with each generation. A century later, the Marquis de Villars sent dispatches to Louis XIV, describing the Spanish king as short, lame, epileptic, senile, and completely bald before 35. He attributed these afflictions to the successive marriages in close degrees of kinship. Foreign diplomats were writing this down, sending it home, gossiping about it across Europe. The decline of the Spanish Habsburgs wasn't a secret. It was dinner conversation in every court from London to Moscow. But surely the Habsburgs' own advisors said something. They did. Court physicians documented their concerns in medical consultations that survive in Spanish royal archives. When Philip IV's first marriage failed to produce a surviving male heir, his physicians explicitly discussed whether the king's health problems, and those of his children, might stem from the accumulated effects of consanguineous marriages. They recommended that any future marriage seek a bride from outside the immediate family. Philip IV received this advice, acknowledged it, and then married his niece Mariana anyway. The medical consultation records this objection and the king's overruling of it. We have the document. We know he knew. So, the evidence is clear. They bred horses successfully for generations using outcrossing protocols. They received warnings from the Church through the dispensation system. They received warnings from foreign diplomats who documented the visible decline. They received warnings from their own physicians who put their concerns in writing. They continued anyway. Which brings us to the real question. Why? To understand why the Habsburgs chose genetic collapse over political dilution, you have to understand what was actually at stake in a royal marriage during the 16th and 17th centuries. A princess wasn't just a bride. She was a territorial claim wrapped in human form. When Philip II sat down to consider who should marry his son, he wasn't thinking about love. He wasn't even thinking about basic compatibility. He was looking at a map of Europe and calculating which marriage would add territory without adding obligations. Think of it like a business merger. You can bring in outside investors who give you capital, but they want board seats. They want influence. They want to shape company policy. Or you can keep the company in the family. Less growth potential, maybe, But you control everything. The Habsburgs wanted to control everything. Under the succession rules of the era, a king's daughter retained claims to her father's territories. Those claims passed to her children. If Philip II had married a French princess, her French relatives would have gained potential claims to Spanish territories. Future generations might have found themselves legally obligated to share sovereignty with cousins in Paris. The same applied in reverse. If a Habsburg princess married into the French royal house, she took potential claims with her, claims that could be activated in a succession crisis. The War of the Spanish Succession, which erupted in 1700 and consumed Europe for 13 years and killed over 1 million people, happened precisely because of these tangled marriage claims. The Habsburgs had spent 2 centuries trying to prevent exactly that kind of dilution. Consider what Philip II gained by marrying his niece Anna of Austria in 1570. He reinforced the alliance between the Spanish and Austrian branches of the Habsburg family. The 2 most powerful Catholic dynasties in Europe remained united against the Protestant threat. He kept Anna's dowry and all future inheritance claims within the family, rather than sending wealth outward to a foreign house. Most importantly, any children from this marriage would have rock-solid claims to both Spanish and Austrian territories. No awkward situation where a French or English grandmother could provide legal justification for a foreign invasion. The family tree looked like a tangled vine. The political structure looked like a fortress. Now consider the alternative. Every foreign marriage came with strings attached. Marrying a French princess meant signing treaties that constrained Spanish foreign policy. It meant accepting French ambassadors with elevated status at the Spanish court. It meant French merchants demanding trading privileges, French priests seeking church appointments, French soldiers expecting to be treated as allies even when French interests diverged from Spanish ones. A marriage to an English princess would have been even worse, potentially requiring religious compromises that would have undermined Spain's position as the champion of Catholic Europe. The Habsburgs looked at these options: genetic risk on one side, political weakness on the other. They chose genetic risk. And this wasn't just a Spanish phenomenon. The Austrian branch made the same calculation, simultaneously, with the same cold logic. Leopold I became Holy Roman Emperor in 1658. He needed a wife. The politically safest option? His niece, Margaret Theresa, the girl you might recognize from Velázquez's Las Meninas, that famous painting of the Spanish Infanta surrounded by her ladies-in-waiting. Margaret Theresa was Philip IV's daughter. Leopold I was her uncle. They married in 1666. Leopold knew what had happened to the Spanish branch. He had eyes. He could see the portraits getting worse with each generation, the jaws jutting further forward, the faces becoming less and less functional. He married his niece anyway, because she was a Habsburg, because her children would have unassailable claims to both Austrian and Spanish territories, because the political mathematics demanded it. Margaret Theresa gave Leopold 4 children in 5 years. 3 died in infancy. The only survivor was Maria Antonia, who was so sickly that courtiers doubted she would live to adulthood. Leopold looked at this outcome, 3 dead babies in 5 years, and concluded that the problem was not the consanguinity, but the specific bride. When Margaret Theresa died in 1673, worn out from pregnancies at age 21, Leopold remarried. His new wife, Claudia Felicitas, was also his cousin. She died within 3 years, after 2 more children who died in infancy. 2 wives, 5 dead children, 1 sickly survivor. Leopold married a 3rd time. Finally, he chose someone from outside the immediate family, Eleanor of Palatinate-Neuburg. She was still distantly related, because everyone in European royalty was distantly related, but she wasn't his niece. His children from this marriage were healthier. One of them, Charles VI, would become Holy Roman Emperor. But here's the thing. Leopold's experience should have been a warning to the entire dynasty. It proved that the physicians and the ambassadors were right. Close marriages produced dead babies. Outcrossing produced healthier heirs. The Spanish branch continued anyway. Philip II's own marriages demonstrate the calculation in action across his entire life. His first wife, Maria Manuela of Portugal, was his first cousin. Their mothers were sisters. She died giving birth to Don Carlos, who was physically and mentally unstable. His second wife, Mary I of England, was his first cousin once removed. That marriage was purely political, designed to bring England into the Catholic orbit. When it failed to produce children and Mary died, Philip briefly considered marrying her Protestant successor, Elizabeth I, but the religious mathematics didn't work out. His third wife, Elizabeth of Valois, was French, a marriage designed to end the Italian Wars, and this foreign marriage required extensive treaty negotiations that constrained Spanish policy for years. When Elizabeth died in 1568, Philip turned back to what he knew worked. He married his niece, Anna of Austria. Accepting the genetic risk in exchange for political simplicity, the pattern continued. Philip III was born from that uncle-niece marriage. He married Margaret of Austria, his cousin. They were both great-grandchildren of Joanna of Castile, making their family tree fold back on itself in ways that would make any horse breeder at the Spanish riding school wince. But Margaret was a Habsburg. No foreign treaties, no diluted claims, no politically inconvenient in-laws. Their son Philip IV continued the tradition. He married Elizabeth of France in 1615, a rare outward marriage requiring extensive diplomatic negotiations. The marriage produced children, but then the deaths started. This is where the human cost becomes impossible to ignore. Philip IV and Elizabeth of France had 8 children. 6 died in childhood. Prince Balthazar Charles, the heir apparent, survived to age 16, old enough to be betrothed, old enough to have his portrait painted by Velázquez, showing a young man on horseback, old enough to represent the future of the dynasty. He died in 1646. Cause: unknown fever, though modern historians suspect the accumulated genetic weakness made him vulnerable to infections that healthier children might have survived. When Elizabeth herself died in 1644, Philip IV faced a succession crisis. He needed a new wife. He needed heirs. His physicians warned him against another close marriage. They pointed to the evidence: 6 dead children from his first marriage, the obvious pattern of weakness. Philip IV ignored them. He married Mariana of Austria, who was not just his cousin, but his niece. Mariana was the daughter of Emperor Ferdinand III and Maria Anna of Spain, who was Philip IV's own sister. Philip IV married his sister's daughter. The woman who had been engaged to marry his dead son, Balthazar Charles, instead married Philip IV himself. The uncle took the bride intended for the nephew. Because the political calculation demanded a Habsburg, because anything else would have meant foreign treaties, diluted claims, outside influence. The marriage was fruitful in the biological sense. Mariana gave birth 5 times. Margaret Theresa, the one who later married Leopold I, survived to adulthood, though she died at 21. A son named Philip Prospero was born in 1657. The court celebrated, finally, a male heir. Philip Prospero was sickly from birth. Court physicians documented recurring fevers, respiratory problems, digestive issues. He was painted by Velázquez in 1659, a portrait showing a pale, fragile boy with enormous dark eyes and the unmistakable Habsburg features already beginning to assert themselves in his small face. The boy in that painting looks haunted, like he already knows. Philip Prospero died in 1661. He was 3 years old. 4 months later, Mariana gave birth again, another son. The court named him Charles, after Charles V, the great emperor who had ruled half of Europe. This Charles would be the last. Charles II of Spain was born November 6, 1661. He was the end product of the Habsburg breeding program. Modern geneticists have calculated his inbreeding coefficient at 0.254. To put that in perspective, a child produced by a brother and sister would have a coefficient of 0.25. Charles was more inbred than that. This isn't metaphor or exaggeration. It's a mathematical fact derived from his family tree, where the same ancestors appear over and over again in different positions. His great-grandmother was also his grandmother. His great-grandfather appears on his family tree multiple times through different lines. If you trace his ancestry back just 5 generations, you find the same people occupying multiple positions: uncle, great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather. The line didn't branch. It folded back on itself until it became a knot. Charles could barely function as a human being. His jaw protruded so severely that his teeth did not align. Chewing was nearly impossible. Contemporary accounts describe servants cutting his food into tiny pieces that he could essentially swallow whole. His tongue was so large that he could barely speak intelligibly. Foreign ambassadors noted the difficulty of understanding him. He suffered from seizures throughout his life. He couldn't walk until he was 8 years old. He wasn't fully weaned until he was 4. Foreign ambassadors reported that he appeared decades older than his actual age, bald and decrepit by his 30s. But here's what mattered most for the dynasty's calculations. Charles could not produce an heir. He married twice. First, to Marie-Louise of Orléans, a French princess who reportedly wept when she learned of the match. Then to Mariana of Neuburg, who was brought in specifically because her family had a reputation for fertility. Both marriages remained childless. When Charles died on November 1, 1700, the Spanish Habsburg line died with him. His autopsy, conducted by court physicians, revealed the full extent of the genetic damage. They reported that his body did not contain a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotten and gangrenous. He had a single testicle, black as coal, and his head was full of water. The physicians didn't understand what they were looking at. They described symptoms, not causes. But modern medicine can read between the lines. A body so compromised by accumulated genetic defects that its organs had never developed properly. Charles II wasn't killed by any single disease. He was killed by being Charles II, the very outcome the Habsburgs had spent generations trying to prevent. Foreign powers using marriage claims to seize Spanish territories happened anyway, because they had no one left to inherit. The French Bourbon dynasty ended up placing Philip V on the Spanish throne. The Bourbons remain there today. Everything they sacrificed, every deformed baby, every early death, every child who couldn't walk properly or speak clearly or live past 30, all of it was for nothing. Which brings us to the verdict. The Habsburgs knew what they were doing. They understood from their own animal breeding programs that close breeding produced weak offspring. They had protocols at the Spanish riding school specifically designed to prevent exactly what they were doing to their own family. They received documented warnings from physicians and advisors. They requested papal dispensations that explicitly acknowledged biological risk. They watched their children sicken and die. They continued anyway, generation after generation, for 200 years, because they decided that concentrated power was worth the cost. Think of it in terms they would have understood. Keeping an inheritance undivided versus letting outsiders claim portions of it. Every cousin marriage was a choice to keep the realm whole at the expense of the heirs who would inherit it. They prioritized the next generation's power over their children's health. They decided, consciously and repeatedly, that deformed jaws and dead babies were acceptable collateral damage. Charles II wasn't an accident. He was the predictable result of a deliberate strategy pursued across 2 centuries. Every uncle who married his niece, every king who wed his cousin, every dispensation request sent to Rome. They were making a choice. Political stability over genetic health, dynastic purity over biological vigor. That famous Habsburg jaw, getting worse with each generation, jutting forward a little more in each portrait, was the visible marker of that choice. A trade-off written in bone and flesh. The horses in the imperial stables were healthier than the children in the imperial nursery, because the Habsburgs applied more care to equine breeding than to human reproduction. What makes this story uncomfortable isn't the suffering, though the suffering was real and terrible. What makes it uncomfortable is the rationality. We want to believe that such outcomes result from ignorance or malice, from people who didn't know better or who simply didn't care. The Habsburg case offers no such comfort. They knew better. They cared deeply about power, about territory, about the continuation of their dynasty. They applied sophisticated understanding of breeding to their horses and dogs. They simply decided that their own children could be sacrificed on the altar of political consolidation. The Marquis de Villars, that French ambassador who wrote such clinical descriptions of Charles II, understood what he was looking at. He wasn't describing a random genetic tragedy. He was describing the end result of a policy, a strategy, a deliberate choice made by generation after generation of rulers who decided that political mathematics mattered more than the children who would inherit the results. 2 centuries of cousin marriages, uncle-niece marriages, a family tree that folded back upon itself until it collapsed. And in 1700, when Charles II died and Europe descended into war over his empty throne, the final accounting came due. Over 1 million people died in the War of the Spanish Succession. The Habsburgs lost Spain anyway. The dynasty they had twisted themselves into genetic knots to preserve fractured into Austrian and Spanish branches. Exactly what they had been trying to prevent. Every choice has a price. The Habsburgs decided their children would pay it. You're watching this video from outside the palace walls. You would never make the same choice. Neither would I. But then again, we're not trying to hold together an empire that stretches from the Philippines to the Netherlands. We're not calculating which marriage alliance will keep French armies out of Milan, or Dutch rebels from seizing Antwerp. The Habsburgs were playing a game with stakes we can barely imagine. Control over trade routes that spanned oceans, authority over territories across 4 continents, the fate of Catholic Europe in the balance. And they looked at all of that, looked at their own children, and made a calculation. They decided their children were acceptable losses. That's not ignorance. That's not accident. That's policy. Subscribe for more stories like this.